we are recording. Okay. Welcome, everybody. My name is Omar Ali. I serve as Dean of Lloyd International Honors College at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. And I teach history, world history, with a focus on the global African diaspora. And this is a Let's Learn event, actually the last of our offerings for 2023. And we are in partnership with the Eastside Institute based in New York. And what Let's Learn is a free set of offerings every semester on a whole range of topics by people who are experts, people who have fancy credentials, and also just people who have just a lifetime of experience. We believe that everyone has something to teach and everyone has something to learn, something my father used to say. We sort of adopted that. And so my partner in Let's Learn the World as a Classroom is Dr. Dan Friedman. So I know a number of you, I see you here, have come on, know Dan and what we've been doing. And if you've just come on, please put on your video. We would love to see your beautiful faces. And you can always put one of those, background screens. This is not what Greensboro, North Carolina looks like. This is actually Cordoba. This is actually Granada, Spain. And so please put on your video camera so we could see you. That'd be great. Thank you. Hello, Carrie. Hello, Lois. Hello, Ruben. Hello, Karen Crawford, Mary Fridley, Logan Sherrill, Karen Rydell. We have so many wonderful people. Imani Taylor. Hi. Hello, Sarah Craig, Barbara Silverman, Howard Edelbaum, Alex. We have lots of people. Come on to the video. We would love to have you. Great. All right. Well, with this, let me hand things over to Dan Friedman. Dan.
Okay, thank you, Omar. Yes, and one of the wonderful things about Let's Learn is that it's free and that all of its teachers are volunteers. And that's we're very grateful that Dr. Dunbar-Ortiz has agreed to share her knowledge and her life and history with us all today. I just want to tell you a tiny bit about who she is. It's hard to capture such a rich and deep life in a few sentences, but Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz is Professor Emeritus in Ethnic Studies at California State University at Hayward. She has a PhD in history from the University of California, Los Angeles, a diploma in international law and human rights from the International Institute of Human Rights in Strasbourg, France, and an MFA in creative writing from Mills College. Dr. Dunbar-Ortiz helped to develop both the Department of Ethnic Studies and the Department of Women's Studies at Hayward. She is the author and editor of many books, in addition to the one we'll be discussing today. Among them, and this is just a sampling, are The Great Sioux Nation, Roots of Resistance, A History of Land Tenure in New Mexico, and Indians of the Americas, Human Rights and Self-Determination. She has also edited 2 anthologies on Native American economic development while she was heading up the Institute for Native American Development at the University of New Mexico. And those are just some of her academic achievements. Equally important to this class, to this audience, I believe, are Dr. Dunbar-Ortiz's achievements as a progressive political activist. She is a pioneer of second-wave feminism. She has been active with the American Indian Movement, the International Indian Treaty Council, and many other Native American resistance and advocacy groups. She has made hundreds of trips to Nicaragua and Guatemala during the US-sponsored war against the revolution there. And she has written 2 books about those experiences, Caught in the Crossfire, The Mosquito Indians of Nicaragua, and Blood on the Border, a memoir of the Contra War. And of course, Roxanne, if I've gotten anything wrong, or just let me know. But I'm going to stop here because if I don't, we won't have time for our conversation. But I think you have a sense of why I'm so grateful that Dr. Dunbar-Ortiz has agreed to talk with us here at Let's Learn, and why I am so honored to introduce you to her. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dan and Omar, for inviting me to be a part of your project, which I think sounds wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it would be good to start by learning a little more about you. Now, as I said in my intro, you've been a progressive activist your entire adult life. I don't need to repeat what I said about your role in feminism in the 60s and your trips to Nicaragua and Guatemala. But not to mention, all the books you've written. But how did your politics develop, and what led you to be an historian?
Well, that's a really good question, because it wasn't automatic. I guess probably I was not intended to do a PhD in history and publish books. I grew up in a tenant farming family in rural central Oklahoma. And it was when Oklahoma was still segregated. The little town, all the little towns were either white, black, or native over the whole state. My father had grown up in the same town, and his father had been in the Socialist Party in Oklahoma. And his father named him Moyer Haywood Scarberry Pettibone Dunbar, after the leaders of the Socialist Party were on trial in Boise, Idaho. So I loved that name. And he would tell me who each one of them were, and they were revolutionaries. So my father was not political, and he was not, I would say he was racist. I think all white people in Oklahoma at that time were pretty much racist. He had only gone to the 9th grade. But just telling me these stories, I always wanted to know more, because I felt like I hadn't met my grandfather, and he sounded like such a wonderful man, who, really, he was actually one of the few he was actually Scots-Irish. All the others were German immigrants, Germans who had come in the 80s and 90s, 1880s, 1890s as socialists in Missouri, Kansas, and Oklahoma. So he was really one of the only few, the only non-immigrant that was a part of that. So that was interesting to me too, that it was unusual, and that you could be unusual and brave and courageous. You didn't have to follow the crowd. And so I had, I went to a rural school. It was a kind of several little towns around, and people on their farms. We were on farms as tenant farmers till I was 6. And then they moved into the little town of 100 people. And the school there was all in one building, just all of us in one building. So it's pretty much just writing arithmetic, and not history for sure. What history? I don't think we even had history classes. Remember a geography class, which I really liked a lot, but I wanted to be a writer, and that was really my goal. I didn't know how to do that, how to be that. I was a great reader, and but this was just in my mind that somehow I wanted to be a writer, and later it kind of turned into I wanted to be a journalist. So I left my hometown for my last year in high school to Central High School in Oklahoma City, and lived with my older sister, who was a secretary. And that was what really made me a political person, because it was the first year of desegregation, 1955. And so the only school in Oklahoma, the only high school in Oklahoma that was desegregated was that school, Central High. It's where all the poor white students were, because it was a school designed so you could work half time and study half time. And it was basically a trade school. They had secretarial trade, they had printing, journalism. So at first I did secretarial. I wanted to be like my sister. But then I got entered, because I liked writing. I took a journalism class and I just loved it. So I became, one of the editors of the daily newspaper, and we had our own printing press. And that was a very, the kind of the outlying students, more radical, kind of 50s hipsters, more than, political. But they really were pretty anti-racist, and there were only about 20 Black students out of about 1,000 students in that school, 350 in my class, the senior class. And they were really mistreated. I witnessed at the lockers, the people shoving the Black girls and boys, shoving them. They would break into their lockers and steal things, or put, dead animals in them. And, witnessing this, I just took a stand, an anti-racist stand, really strongly. And so that was really my first politics, was anti-racism. And it was hard to find other people, but I did then go to the University of Oklahoma, which Oklahomans at that time called the hotbed of communism. And sure enough, the house mother of my dormitory was a communist, called herself a communist. So here I was, I got to be communist. And I also met a Palestinian. So I learned all about Palestine, Israel, when I was my first year of college in 56, 57. So it was really as my boyfriend that I then married was friends with this Palestinian. So he, Saeed Abalugad, and he introduced us to all the Arabs, went to huge dinners. There were a lot of Lebanese who came in the 19th century, but everywhere from the Middle East. So that was an experience, that added to my anti-racism was colonialism. I learned about colonialism from Saeed, and that, what's happening today, this past 6 weeks, I feel very strongly about, because I know the history of Palestine, which people don't much know, and hopefully they're learning now, with the demonstrations and all. So I really then came of age in the middle of the 1960s revolution. And I moved to California. I was married to my husband from when and we moved to California to be with the radicals, get out of Oklahoma. And sure enough, it was just demonstrations. And I then went to San Francisco State and finished there. I got my BA at San Francisco State University. It wasn't as, during the time I was there, the early 60s, it wasn't as radical and, as it became in the later 60s and still is. But it had a lot of very interesting professors and people on campus, and the Du Bois Club was very active the Communist Youth Organization, and of course the the desegregation. That was during the bus rides. I wished I could have gone, but I was married and I was working, and I was a little bit older than the students because I had I had a couple of years I wasn't in college, and so there wasn't really the funds for it. So I was, I had a hard time sort of being a part of that. I was dressed very, nice. And everyone else was dressed in kind of beatnik style. But I did, I had worked, one of my coworkers at Remington Rand she was not a student at San Francisco State, but her husband was. And I became friends with her, and she was often on campus doing things, and meeting her husband. And they were very radical. And they, it's actually the LeSueur family from Minnesota, and old communists.
Roxanne, if I could jump in, you gave me permission before we started
Yes,
to move you along if you
right.
bog down a little. But could you maybe fast forward a little to how you became involved in feminism, and then how you became involved in the Native American movement?
Yeah, I did, I went to graduate school at UCLA, and during that time, 64 to 68, I had finished everything up to my dissertation, writing my dissertation. And I just took off, went back east. I was at UCLA, and I went back east, where I thought the anti-war movement was most active in Boston. And I wanted to be a part of that. And I really, then there was a group of women meeting kind of secretly, these movement women who were doing draft resistance work and everything. And so there was, a poster that said, girls, had a young woman in a mini skirt, flirtatious looking, saying, girls love boys who resist the draft. So that was the level of it. So I suddenly, just got all this anger in me, and I had read The Sick and Six, before that too, but that was mainly focused on, you have your freedom by basically not getting married, not having children, and be your own person. So it wasn't really about women's liberation. And later on, Simone de Beauvoir actually praised the women's liberation movement as what she had not done, and that it actually had changed her. So anyway, there were these grouplets, and they were kind of secret, because they thought it would, they'd literally be kicked out of the movement, which was at its height at that time, the anti-war movement. And also the black movement, Black Power movement was taking off in 1967, and Red Power movement, and the Chicano. So, but women were, kind of, these were almost all men leaders, and all of those groups. So I, being not intimidated by these people, because I didn't care about their approval, became a very vocal feminist in Boston. And I put an ad in the weekly kind of movement paper that people read, and paid for it. I paid for an ad, and gave my home address where the apartment I lived in, and said, women need to stand up and come to this place and we'll form a group. And so the women who showed up were so interesting because they were all working class women, Irish and French Canadian, and they were already involved with the welfare rights organization. So it was the most unusual group. I did not know that there were these groups meeting secretly in New York and in Boston mainly. I think actually in North Carolina, it turns out. And by that time also in California. But they, introduced themselves. And several of them joined our group, which we called Cell 16. And we published a journal, No More Fun and Games. So that was my beginning of, I traveled all over the country. I became a kind of, I don't know, people would call me a celebrity. I thought it was ridiculous because this photographer, Diane Arbus, who liked to, catch people in bad moments and take pictures of them, horrific pictures. She came into our women's group was taking Taekwondo for self-defense. And here comes this woman in black, this huge silver thing. And she got right in front of me. I almost hit her because we were in a stance. We were moving forward and hitting, we weren't hitting anything. It was just exercise, or how we should do things in Taekwondo. And I almost hit her and a flash came in. I thought someone had shot me. I really thought I think my heart stopped with that flash. And then I immediately thought, well, there was no bang. So it wasn't a bullet. And then she was gone. And I didn't even know until she published that picture in Time magazine. I didn't even know who it was that did that. None of us did. What was that, So, okay, my picture's in Time magazine, and that picture of me doing Taekwondo and, kind of making fun of me. But nevertheless, then I was invited to travel all over the country. That's really when I became I already had taught, teaching assistant, and I really loved teaching. I wanted to eventually teach college and did, but I saw it as teaching. I saw what I was doing as teaching. And so I was invited, the women's movement just flourished, spread the radical women's movement. And it was part of it was radical, it wasn't the National Organization of Women, which was okay, but that was, for women getting corporate jobs and stuff, and we were not interested in that. We were anti-capitalist and, and anti-colonialist, and so it was a good time. It was about 5 years of organizing and traveling and living in different places, and also then teaming up with anti-war activists who had brought soldiers back from Vietnam. Vernon Grizzard, he was my partner, and we traveled across the country speaking in GI coffee houses. And he wanted me to speak on women's liberation because these GIs hadn't really gotten it yet. So that was pretty controversial. There was one place that wouldn't he said he wouldn't speak unless I could also speak. So they just canceled it. And in Austin, Texas. So it was a big fort, a big army place.
And then
So
how did you connect to the Native movement, to the indigenous movement?
yeah, that is the next thing. The the American Indian movement formed in 1968. I didn't know that. I knew about, the Alcatraz. I wasn't living in California, and I was living in New Orleans at the time. And I knew about Alcatraz and thought it sounded.
Not everybody here does know about Alcatraz. Maybe you should say
Well,
what.
they know probably it's an island in the Bay
Yeah.
of San Francisco that I can see out my window. And it was a group of California Native people who in the dark of night took a canoe and from the Marin County and which is the closest place to get to Alcatraz, and they paddled over there and then put up a sign, of that they had occupied Alcatraz, and they wanted all land returned to the Indians that had been taken illegally. Some of it had been taken by for money, the Indians, but most of it then the federal government took illegally, and it's still not returned. Most of it is still not returned.
And part of the symbolism or the resonance of taking over Alcatraz is it had been a federal prison for many years.
Yeah, it was such a symbol because they said, we're the prisoners now, because it had been it's still federal property, but it was they had said all the it was cruel and unusual punishment be on the rock, no water, no. So anyway, they then organized all kinds of Native groups, and there were many in Northern California because of relocation. I know you asked about relocation later, so you should bring it up now, because this was the reason there were so many Lakota people. Lakota people, became kind of dominant at the Alcatraz, the 18 months there. They became very active there, but they were from here. They had the relocation program was in 1953, there was the Termination Act that the Senate, which is the body of government that controls Native people still today, they still live on federal property, they're not owners. But they made a termination of their status as Native people, and that land would be allotted and they had to leave. And of course, they didn't leave. They got 2 small reservations in Oregon, or one in Michigan and one in Oregon, that bought into it and started migrating. But the others resisted, but they then developed this relocation program in 1956. And with that, it was a carrot for the young people. They thought they could, all the young people would, get tired of these poverty and the rural areas. And this was a time of youth culture. They were leaving anyway, to some of them to go to school or to change things, and that they would just jump at the chance of free bus ride from wherever they were. The points were Chicago, Dallas, Cleveland, I think Phoenix, Alaska, Anchorage, they had to go there,
Yeah.
they couldn't
The-
go.
So the federal government put them in buses and took them to these urban centers and
Well, they didn't, they didn't force them.
Yeah.
But when they did relocation, I mean, that's what they wanted to get rid of them. But when they did relocation, the young people wanted to go get jobs. They needed jobs, and they were promised jobs and housing and all that did not come through. It was a
Right.
very miserable for the urban Indians. But that's where Anne came from.
Yeah, it grew out of that. Yes, it started in Minneapolis, right? Originally. But this might be a good time to segue into the book, which is for those who don't know, is the Indigenous Peoples History of the United States. Robin D.G. Kelly, who is an important historian in his own right, said that this may be the most important U.S. history book you will read in your lifetime. And it certainly has had a huge impact beyond what most history books are. But I thought we might just jump into the content of the book now, because it covers 400 years of the rolling genocide of indigenous peoples in that part of North America that we now call the United States. And it's been an endless, and grossly uneven war conducted on the one hand by the state, that is by the official armed forces, but also often and often primarily by civilians, that is by generation upon generation of settlers themselves, and hundreds of peoples and their histories and their cultures and languages are gone forever. And most of those who did survive the genocide have been reduced to poverty and dependency, and some of the stuff you've already been talking about. So I know it's impossible to discuss in the time we have everything in the book, but I thought I wanted to suggest that there might be 3 incidents or 3 stories or 3 things you could talk about that would help to convey to the students the nature and scope of that genocide.
Yeah, they said every man, every settler is a soldier, and that's the book is really about settler colonialism. We see this in Israel right now, South Africa, Northern Ireland, where in the case of Northern Ireland, the first example is the British Empire organized Scots and Welsh people to have free land in Northern Ireland, so they could just go and push off the Irish owners and make them into tenant farmers and own the land. And there's still 50% of the population in Northern Ireland that flares up and will again, because it's not really settled. So settler colonialism is really different from the colonialism of Africa, Asia, and most of South America, where only agents came. It was very repressive with just agents, but they went home from India, or they went home from Mexico. A few stayed and to conquer other lands, but so I wanted to base it in, or it took a while, for me to come to what is the thread through this book, because it wasn't going to be a textbook, it was going to be a book of literature. And so I saw that settler colonialism and its necessary twin, militarism, the military, the army. So the United States is really founded as a military settler state, and it still has that all the wars. The United States is, I say in the book, and I still am waiting for someone to call me on it, that there hasn't been a day in the existence of Anglo North America since 1607 that there hasn't been war, not a day. And that, it's just they were already on the shores of course, of Tripoli, but also on shores of all of the Third World by the time Jefferson came into office. So it was born as an empire and a settler state. And so that's the history. It's not really a book, a history of Native Americans. I mean, I mention a few case studies that I know best, but it's actually the history of the United States. And the only really accurate history of the United States you can defend is that which is how the land was taken. And then with, African slavery, how it became the first capitalist state of the Cotton Kingdom. So there are several really, really good books from Ivy League historians on with that thesis that the Cotton Kingdom was the founding of capitalism. Capitalism was founded in the world in the Cotton Kingdom, the United States, and the banking system related to it in New York. So that was, that was my thesis, was militarism and settler colonialism. So settler colonialism is a rare form of colonialism, but obviously a very powerful one with the United States. But there are lesser settler colonial states like Canada, Argentina, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa. Only in South Africa, the white people never did outnumber, they tried, and under apartheid, they forced the Black people into their own states. So South Africa became majority white just by enclosing Black people onto these fake independent states, the Baptistans.
We're more like reservations are here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And what inspired you to write the book? What led you to this project?
I didn't, it never really occurred to me to write the book. There was in 1986, when I was, back and forth from Central America and seeing US imperialism at work, and losing, the Contra War, just devastating, that I felt I had to write. I had been writing. I had, been doing work at the UN, non-governmental human rights work, since 1977, and so I focused then on Central America in that work and got involved with the UN refugee program, because there were all these refugees from Guatemala and Nicaragua and Honduras. So I spent a lot of time there in the refugee camps. So I was really burnt out from these dozens and dozens of trips back and forth to report to the UN, because the Reagan administration was telling so many lies, making up things, as Israel is doing right now, I think, that got into the newspapers, and just being able to go and see if that really happened, and would find that it had not happened, and come back, report to the UN. So I was exhausted, and I decided I have to write a history of the United States, and I wrote 100 pages. It's just pure ranting. It's just a rant. It's a 100-page rant. I know as a historian, that's, that's not writing history correctly. But it kind of was got it out of my system, of being so frustrated. So I didn't really think about ever going back to it. It kind of became, people started making copies of it. I showed it to, my daughter, and she made copies and was giving it out to her friends, and they were making copies. And, it was getting around anyway. It was very interesting. But I never did really think of, I wanted to write this book on Nicaragua, my time there that became Blood on the Border, a memoir. It is a history. I called it historical memoir. I wrote 3. I ended up writing 3 of them. And the Contra War was one, Blood on the Border. So I did that during the 1990s. I got my MFA in writing, trying to get out of the harness of the academia to be able to write literature that would be read by more people. And so I worked very hard at that. Like I say, I spent 2 years getting an MFA and in creative writing. And I started publishing some of it in articles. So the books started coming out in 1998. And once I did the Blood on the Border in 2006, I started another writing project, which is about Oklahoma. And it was going to be, Oklahoma before it was Oklahoma, when it was Oklahoma Territory and ridden with bandits. And there's one bandit, Bill Starr, who was a woman. Very few of them were women. She was my childhood hero. And of course, here's this, armed on a horse, Bill Starr, the pictures of her, she was kind of and there were movies, I think 3 movies made, terrible movies made about Bill Starr. And I knew it wasn't true. And her daughter was interesting too. She had one daughter, but she married a Native person, a Cherokee, and he was a Confederate. They turns out they're Confederate guerrillas, Bill Starr. And I said, oh my God, my childhood hero is a Confederate guerrilla story. She ran with all of the other guerrilla groups and fighting the Union in the Confederacy. So she was no longer a hero of mine, but I was going to write who she really was and about her daughter, who was very interesting, who ran a very famous brothel in Fort Smith, Arkansas.
If I could jump in for a minute, it's a parallel story. One of my heroes as a young person was Jesse James.
Oh, of course. Well, she wrote
because he supposedly robbed from the rich and gave to the poor.
Exactly.
And then when I found out he had been a Confederate guerrilla,
boom!
I actually wrote a play about it.
Did you? Yeah.
His dilemma of deciding between class and race. But anyway, sorry, I just couldn't resist sharing.
I think it had, it really startled me because I wasn't that young, when I realized he was, when I started writing about Bill Starr or researching, that she rode with the James Gang, and they were Confederate guerrillas fighting the Union, the John Brown people in Kansas.
Yeah. So how did this lead to the book?
Well, so anyway, as I was getting involved and had done all the research, and this was my next project, I got a call from an editor at Beacon Press telling me about a series that she had. This is Gaitra Piatek, who's now president of Beacon Press. She had created a series of different perspectives on United States history. and she had published one, actually, it was the gay history of the United States that came out first. And she sent it to me as an example of what it was. It would be less than 300 pages, preferably, 280 or so. And it would be literary and not, heavy. It had footnotes and all, but references, be real history, but more like Howard Zinn's book, People's History of the United States. And so she proposed this to me. She said, would you be interested in writing it? And I thought, wow, that would be easy. I could write that probably in a month or two. And he says, well, okay, but we'll give you, let's get a 9-month contract. Well, it didn't get published till 2014 because it wasn't an easy book to write. It was the hardest thing I've ever worked on, because to put of all U.S. history, I knew I had to have a perspective. And I think I've already said this, that I did find that to be U.S. militarism and settler colonialism. And fortunately, settler colonialism had begun to be written about and discussed as existing mostly in journals at the time. And that was, it was obvious, but to give it an analysis, and not just to take it for granted, because it's unusual. It's in other parts of the colonized world, were not, they kept their land, and when they did get free, they had their land. They hadn't lost it, except in South Africa. So, but in Southeast Asia, when they got rid of the colonizers, they're independent. So I kept having to renew the contract. I tried to get out of it. I got a writing partner, a great Native American historian, a Seminole from Oklahoma. And I got her to be a co-author. And we did together write the what is pretty much the final introduction about the pre-history of North America. And she's a great historian, but she backed out. She said that she had health problems. Her daughter was getting a divorce. She was taking care of her grandchildren, and she just couldn't do it. So I understood, but then I tried to get someone else to write. I just kept trying to get someone else to write this book.
But you wound up writing it. Congratulations. Yes.
And I had the most patient editor in the world, or persistent.
Great.
She knew I could write this book, so I did.
Right. And it certainly has, as we said earlier, had a big impact. One of the things that I found very helpful in the book that I wasn't aware of specifically was, obviously there was a physical genocide with millions of people being killed. And there was also, of course, a huge, a continuous war on the economic organizations, the cultures, the languages, the religions, the traditions of North America, the North American people before the Europeans arrived. And while there was great variety among them, one thing that's I think we can agree on is that the vast majority lived in ways that today we might call cooperative or caring or collective. And one of the basic attacks on that, which is you document in your book, was on the economic organization and values of Native society, on this collectivity of the ownership of the land and of the the produce, whether it be the animals or the crops and so on, which took place in 1887, the General Allotment Act of 1877, which some people aren't aware of, which basically was an attempt, as I understand it, to force private property upon Native peoples Could you talk about that act and if I've got it right and what impact it had?
Yeah, and there was, the communal democracy basically in Native nations. And as they were attacked, for instance, they had under Andrew Jackson, they had emissaries to go down, really diplomatic people to embed themselves with the Cherokees and the Muskogee people, Creek and Seminole, to sell them on slavery, that they could, because they still had the land, they hadn't been evicted yet, but it was already being planned. But they wanted to have the, really introduce capitalism. And of course, in the United States, capitalism meant also slavery was the main source of capital. And so that they did take up, it's kind of a shame. They did take up, they broke down the communal decision making, where they came together in great, villages gathered together, and sometimes spent months and months. It drove the US crazy when they were trying to make treaties, because they would go over and over this for months and months until they got they got everyone agreeing. If there's one person that disagreed, until they took in that person's doubts, they wouldn't do it without full democratic. But that took a lot of time. It takes a lot of time. You can't do it in one election or something. And so what they introduced was a different way of governing, for one thing, by really bribery and, having kind of different, the idea of being wealthy was introduced. And so a class system started developing in the Southeast. And they had just done almost total genocide on the East Coast and the Northeast and all. But in the South, it was the Jackson era that relocated all of the Native people from the Southeast. These, they were it was the oldest agricultural place in the whole world, one of 8 original places of agriculture. And they turned it into slavery and cotton instead of food, food crops. And so they, the horrible march, the Cherokees wouldn't leave. They had to go and literally with guns force them out of their houses and burn their houses down in their villages. And then they put them on the long walk, that they had to. So all of them were forcibly relocated. And one document I read that just, I don't know why, it really gets to you. I just cry every time I read it, is that they had dogs were just so much a part of these communities, and just almost like human. They treated them almost like, just families. And when they had to cross the Mississippi River, the soldiers didn't allow them to take the dogs. So all the dogs were jumping in the water, some drowned, and they were crying and screaming for their people. And it was just, the description of it was just, it just sort of just summarizes the pain, of being taken away from your ancient homeland and put in this, where I grew up, this kind of raggedy half desert. The western half where I grew up was very arid, and the eastern part was, was little mountains, and they were able to farm there, but it was a condensed space, just the space.
Yeah.
The spatial aspect of it was they were just crowded together.
And later in the century, when most of the native peoples had been forced onto reservations, it was then a federal law, right, that forced other peoples to privatize the land.
Yeah, that was the Dawes Act of privatizing the all Indian lands, but starting in Oklahoma. And so they did privatize the the whole eastern part, the five so-called five civilized tribes. Now in the West, they hadn't yet completely conquered the Plains Indians, the Southern Cheyenne, and there were about five different. The part I grew up in, what had been Southern Cheyenne territory. They respected each other's territories among themselves, the native people. They weren't like, states with that you had to go through customs or something. But it was, they then later they also broke those up. And only the Navajo Nation was really allowed to, they just emptied it of people during the Civil War on the long march, to the desert, where half of their numbers died. And some had secretly been able to stay there, mostly, like the medicine men and stuff. So they were allowed to go back, and they have an intact, except for one area that was broken up into lots, one small area. It's a complete, nation, and can act as a nation. I think it could be its independent nation state. And some Navajos have that in their future. One, I asked him, well, how long will you think it will take before you can be a state? And he actually started writing and figuring things. He said, I think this was about 10 years ago. He said, I think 30 years. So they're headed for that, nation state status, and other native people too.
This might be, I have so many more questions I could ask, but I think it's about time that we opened it up for everybody. There's lots of folks here, and I know many of them have questions or thoughts. And so, Omar, if you could put us back to gallery view.
Mm-hmm.
And I would ask people, if you have questions for Roxanne, please raise your hand. Electronically would be best. And for those of you who don't know how to do that, you go down to where it says reactions at the bottom of your screen. And then all these icons come up, and at the very bottom, it says raise hand. And that automatically puts you to the top left corner of the screen, and we'll know you're. On the other hand, I don't want to be totally rigid about it. So if you just want to talk, shout out your question, that's fine too.
Yeah.
Everyone's talking at once.
Yes, that's exactly what's happening. It's canceling out each other. That's what's happening.
Well, here's
Imani.
somebody. Imani.
You had talked about at the beginning how you originally wanted to be a journalist and how you were getting involved in public advocacy from a young age. And that's something that I'm also interested in. My career goal is to become a journalist, and I just recently added a minor in public advocacy writing. So I just wanted to find out more about getting involved in different things, how you kind of find a way to advocate for the things you care about, and what inspired you more to get into it.
Yeah, I think it's easier now for women to, used to be all men, except now and then an amazing woman journalist. But back when I wanted to be a journalist, it was it was very hard to get into a journalism school. And of course, I had to have 2 years of school before I could even have a major. So I ended up doing history, but I think most of the rest of the world do not have journalism schools. They think it's strange that the United States, you have to study to be a journalist, because it's a craft, it is a craft, and it's a literary activity at the same time, combined. I love reading newspapers and magazines, some really good reporters, and we still have some. The technology has taken a lot of it away, but it's still good, and I'm glad you're thinking about that. But I think it's really good to get some advice, from, if a journalist or a journalism teacher that could give you advice on how best to proceed the field. And we have a great journalism department school. It's a school, a whole school, not just a department, at UC Berkeley. People come from all over the world to study there, and very low tuition. So that would be one place that I would think of.
Thank you.
Cheryl, you're next. Cheryl in New York.
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
I'm very glad to be here today. I had just started reading your book a few weeks ago. I borrowed it from the library electronically, but nonetheless thrilled to be here and to be reading your book. And I guess one thing I don't really know how to put what's on my mind into a question, but I'll try. I guess there's so many. I feel like your book is one example of people understanding that there's more. People have various backgrounds, and the United States. When I was a kid, I'm in my 60s now. It seemed like as you were watching TV, it was before Black people were invented. Just because of what you would see from the dominant culture, what was presented on TV. Now I know, here I am in my 60s. I know Black people exist. I know Native Americans exist. I know people of, various, backgrounds and colors and stripes exist. And I think that's a good thing. And here we are with endless days, millennia without wars, just ongoing. And I guess I don't even know how to put it. Like, can we? All people of color shouldn't be fighting other people of color. And the United States is definitely getting to a point where it's majority people of color. And I there's if to sneak one more thing in there, I think about like indigenous cultures, and I don't know if this is necessarily true because I'm only thinking of one source. Am I cut off now? Is everybody frozen, or is it just me?
It's just you. We can hear you.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll turn off my camera. It usually goes better then. But as far as gayness and being something that is an important dynamic or dimension of people, that is still, people are still being shunned, still being attacked and brutalized. And, I know, and when I grew up, it's like there's no such thing. You cannot be. There's no such thing as a Black lesbian. That's something that you get from white people. I just don't know how to overturn, that. So it's more. I think we're making strides, but if you hear a question in what I'm saying, thank you.
Well, I share your frustration with how how things are now. I think the gains of the civil rights movement that spawned also the Native American movement and Chicano and Asian American, that and helping, you know, and developing ethnic studies departments, African and African American studies. It's it really was, you know, it has held to a great extent. It was really a lot was reversed during the Reagan administration, and but I think, you know, I think that there's a solid basis. The only thing is, of course, that the public stopped paying, you know, taxes for supporting university students. So now they have to pay so much. It's unimaginable. I went from freshman in college through a PhD without ever paying a single penny of money beyond my books and my food, you know, without scholarship, no scholarship. So it was, you know, the only scholarships were you could take off from teaching assistant of what you're doing and go write your book. And that was extra beyond no, you know, they gave that to you. So I don't even know how young people without their family having great means are able to go to college anymore, go to university. And I think it's very, very it's on purpose. I want people to be stupid, you know, because well-educated, informed people make better decisions about politics and work, right, and labor and what is equality.
Yes, and there are many university students with us today, so maybe we'll hear from some of them about how they're doing that. Let's hear from Terry in Alaska.
Yeah, I just had a question about where do you see the hope for healing justice and transformation for the Native and Indigenous communities today?
Well, I think it's you know, it's still a work in process. That there's a lot of land that needs to be restored, you know, and I think among the young Native people, that is the motto, that is the word, that's the t-shirt, that's what's on the caps, is land back with an exclamation point. And I think there is a building movement for that, from Alaska to Florida to California to the East Coast and all over, for land back. And we see it happening somewhat more in Canada. You know, there's actually restitution of land, fewer controls on people. Native people still don't own reservation land. It's in trust. And the Senate could at any time simply pass a law and erase the whole land base. And there are groups of people, these right-wing groups, I mean, they've been around for 50 years now, who are well-funded and working at that, you know, to privatize the reservations, you know, and to bring corporations in and all. So I think, you know, the gains that have been made have held pretty well, but they've kind of frozen in place. And I think we do have a new generation of young people that are going to be not doing all the mistakes of people in the American Indian movement, but having the same determination, because everyone's learned a lot since then.
Roxanne, before we have two more questions, Karen and Lois have questions, but we did have a question in the chat from one of the students here. Dear Dr. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, recommendations. Do you have recommendations for further reading? Can you please recommend any other books or resources for students who want to learn more about Indigenous history and culture? Thank you.
Well, you know, the National Book Award for nonfiction was just given to Ned Blackhawk, whose book came out this year, and I wrote a blurb for it. It's a great book. It's also it goes back to the 12th century, when it was all native land, to the present, and it's very well written. There's a review in the New York Times. I'm not sure when it's day. I read it today, but I don't know if it's today. But you could Google it and find the review, New York Times review of
What's it called? What's the title?
The title of the book is getting now a history.
The Rediscovery of America.
Rediscovery of America. Yeah, Rediscovery of America. That's a wonderful book, very much available, and now, you know, won the National Book Award. There's so much good literature now, some of it local in different places. I would recommend you read, if you're interested in the Southwest, My Roots of Resistance, A History of Land Tenure in New Mexico. It actually goes beyond New Mexico to, you know, back to when the Spanish conquerors came, and up to the present. Phil Deloria has Phil Deloria who was Vine Deloria Jr.'s son, is a professor of history at Harvard. And he wrote a wonderful book on playing Indians, is called, you know, and he talks about, you know, people who dress up and have these imitations of Indians, sort of like blackface, and then others who claim to be Indian, and you know, it makes the point of that you don't claim to be Indian, the tribe claims you, you know, that if you're not claimed by the tribe, you're not an Indian.
And do you know the name of that book?
Playing Indians.
Oh, Playing Indian. Missed that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a really good book. He's a great historian, and he's written a couple of books since then, so you could look him up, Phil Deloria. And let's see, Dina Gideon Whitaker, she and I wrote a book together called All the Good in, let's see, All the Bad Indians Are Dead, and 20 arguments for I can't even think of the name of our book, but it's also Beacon Press. And Dina also has written a book on Indigenous environmentalism. So Dina Gilio, Gilio Whitaker, has written a couple of very good books.
Thank you.
There are so many authors. If you go to Google Wikipedia for Native American authors, you'll get, you know, thousands of names, and a lot of them are poets. There's I think the percentage of Native writers who are poets is greater than the population in general. Poetry is very much like the old languages, you know, the and kind of out of materialism, really getting to the soul of things. And I didn't understand that till I was married to a poet, Simon Ortiz. We were together for 5 years in the 70s. That is really powerful. Yeah, poetry is a thing, and especially Native poetry. So I would say that there's a let's see, what's her name?
Oh, well, instead of what you can work on that because there's like, as you say, there's thousands of authors, and people can Google that now. And I just wanted two things that are in the chat to share is that off of the slogan "Land Back," Terry has posted a map of the native land bases where they originally had been, and he also noted that there's a Bay Area has a good land tax program giving back in a monetary way. But we have two people waiting to ask questions, and I'm conscious of the time, so excuse me for my interruption. But Karen, what would you like to ask or say?
Let me unmute myself. Yeah, the term of settler colonialism. Who first gave that term? Is that your term? Tell us about the definition, because I think the concept between our traditional idea of colonialism and settler colonialism is a really important distinction. And since it took about 400 or 500 years for there to be sort of the situation that we find ourselves in now. There were lots and lots and lots and lots of settler interactions that were pretty awful all the way through.
Yeah.
So talk about that term, settler colonials.
Yeah, every settler a soldier. That's the sort of short definition, but it's to take the land and clear it of the people who are there. And it isn't the mainstream of Western colonialism, but it came in with the British Empire in Northern Ireland was the first place. It was the map for it. It's still contentious today to bring Scots and Wales, who were sometimes landless, over to give them free land, and pushing out the Irish, who then came in great numbers, 2 million of them, landless Irish, coming in the 1849, and they were starving. They were actually starving, and so that's settler colonialism. The mapping of it, the model, is then applied, by the British in North America and all of Canada and the United States, is to kill off the native people and replace them with settlers who will then produce crops and produce rum, especially sugar, to ship back to London to build its economy, its capitalist economy. So the settlers then broke free of that. That was really settler revolt in the United States, and then they mapped out with the Northwest Ordinance the settling of the rest of the continent, and then the Pacific, and then to China was their ultimate goal of, and I think that's still riveted in the psyche of U.S. governments, passed down in the rhetoric and in the. So settler colonialism is only in a few places. Is Canada. It's almost exactly the same, except for the military power of the United States. And its economy. Canada's mostly ice, so it's really a small strip of land. And then there's the Argentina was later as kind of copycat. They killed off, the native people. It's still, they still exist. The people don't disappear completely, but they, on reservations, and they've gained some. And Chile, the southern part of Chile, is settler colonialism. And of course, before that, Australia and New Zealand. And South Africa was very interesting because it was the English who came in and started settler colonialism. And then the Spanish imitated it. And so Latin America is not settler colonialism, but the later parts, after it was success of the United States, it was. So where did the term come from? It's in the history field and in Indigenous studies. It's been around for a long time, and I think it actually came from South Africa, though.
Mhm.
The analysis of people, of anti-apartheid people, named it that.
Right.
That's where I first learned it, in 1960s. The first time I met a South African who was had gotten out of South Africa to organize.
So it goes back a ways, although some of us are just learning it more recently.
Yeah.
We only have 5 minutes. So, Karen, I see you seem posed for another question, but I do want to give
Well,
Lois a
it was
chance.
just to contrast with the other
Yeah,
more traditional.
that's just go conquer with armies.
Yeah.
Take over, make them, control them, and leave armies to control them. And then finally, the most important thing is to recruit people of the people to be their bosses themselves. That is to elevate certain natives to be to control it, so then they can leave India, because the Raj is in control on behalf of Britain, and until they had their revolution.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Lois.
I feel my life is enriched by this past hour and a half. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I was wondering about the difference for you, the impact, let's say, of many issues, but the Indigenous history in particular, the difference, what happens to you emotionally and politically when you are aware of something and then you go deep into the particulars of, in this case, Indigenous history. Like, what's been the impact, if you could speak about that a little bit, emotionally on you and also politically?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because one reason it took me so long to write that book, Indigenous Peoples, more than any other I've written, was I had to get away from it at times. I actually went to an evening, it was 2 nights a week of a psychoanalytical, a psychoanalyst in training. He was in training by senior psychoanalysts. That's how they, like an intern, only not in a hospital. And so he set up this thing that was almost free. It was only $10 a session to practice on us, and there were only 5 of us. And I think that was, that really helped me, because I talked about it, what the trouble I was having with the book and everything. And because it's hard to talk to just people, because they say, yeah, I'm sure. Well, some people say, how long did it take you to write the book? And I say, well, 4 years. And 4 years, it took that long. It's not that big a book, as if I was sitting there just writing it off, the book Loaded I wrote about guns. I wrote in a month. It was easy because I knew it all. But this book had to be it had to be a powerful literary argument, and I had to find these strands. And of course, I found them in militarism and settler colonialism. The two tubes, of the formation of the United States. And it was really emotional reading the sources. I think especially when I got to the boarding schools and reading actually former students in these boarding schools who are still alive, writing, and some are still alive. The boarding schools went up to the 1950s. And I just almost couldn't read it. I mean, the things that were done to them, the raping of children, the punishments, the locking them up, in solitary confinement. And I went to this Carlisle. If you ever get to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, go out to that town, that army base, what it's called. Anyway, it's the first boarding school, and it's now a museum. And it describes what all things, and the kinds of beatings, the different things they used to beat the students. So they'd be bleeding. And then this little hole where they would put them in isolation, dark, concrete with an iron door. And you really have to go see that place. It was an accident. I was invited to speak at a Mennonite college that's nearby, and they just asked me, "Would you like to go over and see the museum?" And yeah, I'm in Carlisle. So yeah, that was the hardest part. The children.
Yeah.
And then how they grow up and they pass that on, intergenerational trauma. A lot of groups have formed among Native people, in their own families, about how they then beat their children, and their children then beat, their children, and a lot of violence, just internalized violence.
Yeah. But unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time. I mean, the sadness and pain of what you just spoke about is an appropriate note to end on, because it's something we shouldn't forget and that we all should learn more about. And that's why we invited you here. I do want to encourage everyone to read the book. And the link to it is in the it's easy to find. Just type in the name on Google and you'll get it. But there's also a link to the publisher in the chat. And I thank you all for coming from wherever you came from. And well, this is the last class of the semester. But Let's Learn will be back in February with more interesting people and more things to learn and teach each other. And I just wanted to thank you all for coming. It might be, I'm going to put you on the spot, Ruben, because Ruben is from Nicaragua, now in exile in Spain. And it might be that you want to ask or say a quick question to Roxanne about her experience there. Or you can do it offline. I could connect you guys offline. Okay, why don't we do that? All right. Thank you all. Was great having you here. And Roxanne, I can't thank you enough for your time. And I hope you found it interesting.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dan. Thanks, Omar.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye,
Yeah.
Betty.
Bye,
Thank you.
guys.
Right. Thank you, Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. Right.
Terrific. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you,
Welcome.
Omar. Welcoming us all.
Thank you, Terry.
Thank you. Let's learn.
You're welcome, Jill. Thanks for coming.
Yeah.